Good morning, and thank you for joining today's webinar on the Solar to Grid report, focused on the trends in system impacts, reliability, and market value of solar in the United States. This work was funded by the Department of Energy through the Solar Energy Technologies Office. My name is Andrew Mills, and I'm a research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department. And today, I'll be joined by Dr. Yo Seal, a senior scientific engineering associate in the same department. I also want to acknowledge that this report includes significant contributions from this full list of authors from the Berkeley Lab. During today's webinar, we'll present for about 45 minutes, leaving 15 minutes or so to answer questions. Please use the Q&A button to submit your questions. If we do not get to all of them, we will try to follow up via email after the webinar. The slides for today's presentation are posted and available on the link that's at the bottom of the slide, and I've also added it to the chat right now. This webinar will be recorded and we'll post it to our website within a few days. The purpose of this report is to assess the trends in the market value and grid impacts of deployed solar based on what's been observed through 2019. We don't try to assess future impacts. Rather, the goal is to provide a foundational anchoring point for forward-looking assessments. This report addresses the question of what have we seen so far, so that it may inform expectations with continued solar deployment and help to identify priority issues for mitigation. We see the primary audience as the solar industry, grid planners, utility regulators, policymakers, researchers, and R&D managers. The focus of the report is the 7 organized wholesale markets in the US. Organized wholesale markets provide the greatest transparency and cover more than 2/3 of the US demand. The report also includes a more limited assessment of solar in 10 additional non-ISO utilities, all with growing solar across the US. But because we don't have as clear of a picture of the grid impacts and market value of solar in these non-ISO regions, we'll typically present results from these regions separate from the results in the ISOs. The approach that we used is to start by defining the full universe of all deployed solar based on 2 different sources. We have plants that are covered in EIA's 860, which are generally larger than 1 megawatt. We call these utility scale PV. Then we also have aggregate PV installations in EIA's 861, which we call distributed PV. Together, these include both in front of and behind the meter PV. We then use historical weather data and NREL's System Advisor Model, or SAM, to create plant-level hourly profiles for each of these individual PV plants. We use the plant's reported monthly generation level and ISO reported aggregate solar profiles to then debias these profiles. It's sort of a correction that we apply to them. For distributed PV, we use SAM and historical weather data to generate county-level aggregate profiles. Next, we then use these hourly profiles to assess 3 primary topics. We look at the reliability contribution of solar based on the ISO definitions of capacity credit. We look at the market value of solar based primarily on its capacity and energy value. And we also look at impacts to the bulk power system, including impacts on the net load shape and the need for increased flexibility. Beginning with this inventory of deployed solar, it's clear that the California ISO has by far the largest amount of deployed solar, and solar makes up the greatest share of the annual load of any region. In 2019, more than 19% of the annual load was met by solar in California. CAISO saw 2.4% of this solar being curtailed, which we report here in orange on the figure in the top right. ERCOT's the only other region that reports curtailment data. On a percentage basis, ERCOT's solar curtailment of 5% exceeded that of the California ISO, but ERCOT's curtailment was due to local transmission congestion, whereas at least 1/3 of the solar curtailment in CAISO was due to system-wide oversupply. PJM has the next highest solar capacity, though because of the large size of the overall system, solar there met less than 2% of the annual load. So of the organized wholesale market regions, ISO New England had the second highest solar penetration at just over 4%, while 3 of the 10 selected non-ISO utilities, all in the Southwest US, had between 8 to 12% penetration in 2019. Now we'll turn to the reliability contribution of solar, with a focus on the capacity credit. The capacity credit reflects how much of the solar nameplate capacity grid planners count toward resource adequacy. ERCOT only uses the capacity credit in advisory assessments, whereas the capacity credit in the other regions determines how much the solar nameplate capacity can count towards meeting mandatory resource adequacy targets. Here we use the ISO rules or report the values that are used by the ISOs without trying to assess the validity of their particular capacity accreditation methods. We know from extreme weather events in CAISO in 2020 and last week in ERCOT that these metrics and methods for ensuring resource adequacy are being continually reevaluated. And we'll talk about performance of solar during extreme events later in the presentation. Across the ISOs, 45 to 76% of the solar nameplate capacity counts towards resource adequacy targets in the summer. This reflects the fact that summer peak load periods are often in the early afternoon when solar generation is strong, though it's not quite at its full nameplate capacity. In contrast, winter peak load periods are often at night after the sun sets. So for those regions that assign a winter capacity credit, it's often near zero for solar. ERCOT's most recent winter assessment, for example, used a 7% capacity credit for solar. These capacity accreditation methods vary across ISOs. ERCOT, for example, focuses on the fleet-wide average solar generation level during the top 20 peak load hours for each season, whereas ISOs on the East Coast assess plant-level generation during broad, static peak load periods. In 2018, the California ISO changed its capacity accreditation method to what's called an effective load carrying capability, or ELCC method. This relies on a probabilistic assessment of the risk of outages. This effective load carrying capability method evaluates how much the load can be increased after adding solar, while still maintaining a level of reliability that's equal to the level prior to the solar being added. This method can account for the fact that increasing solar penetration can shift the periods of high risk of outages into the early evening, which can result in a decreased capacity credit of solar. PJM filed with FERC to similarly use this ELCC method starting this year. I'll note that none of the current capacity credit methods in use at the ISOs use methods that account for the sort of highly correlated outages that were observed in ERCOT. Some do focus on production during peak load events or use historical load patterns in their assessments, but the outages are generally modeled as independent events in the probabilistic assessments. Again, we'll turn to examples of solar production during extreme events at the end of the presentation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Yo to describe how we use the solar generation profiles to estimate the market value of solar.
Thank you, Andrew, and a warm welcome from me as well. I'm happy to present now on the market value of solar. In this section, we analyze the historical market value of solar generation within the 7 organized wholesale power markets managed by ISOs across the United States. And we also use a similar but somewhat less granular approach to estimate the value of solar for 10 non-ISO utilities. Next page, please. Our analysis focuses on the location-specific energy and capacity value of solar averaged across residential, commercial, and utility-scale sectors. In the organized wholesale markets, solar's energy value represents the product of real-time energy prices at the nearest node and the coincident solar generation. We have developed plant-level hourly generation estimates that are based on project-specific technical characteristics and historical irradiance records. We debias those generation profiles using both ISO-wide hourly solar records and plant-level monthly records. For the distributed solar, we developed only county-level profiles. Solar's capacity value represents solar's contribution to meeting resource adequacy requirements, and it is determined by the capacity credit that Andrew just talked about and the coincident capacity prices. Capacity prices have zonal granularity in MISO, PJM, NISO, and ISO New England, and can vary by month, season, or even year. For regions without organized capacity markets, such as SPP, we estimate bilateral capacity prices using the FERC EQR data. And in contrast to the energy value, capacity value can be harder to monetize for solar project owners because of additional performance requirements or other market restrictions. We also follow a similar approach in the non-ISO utilities, although the price records for those utilities are often less transparent and have a lower resolution. We use location-specific energy prices for utilities participating in the Western energy imbalance market, or a single representative energy price series for utilities that are not in the EIM. The solar's total market value is then simply the sum of its energy and capacity value expressed on a pre-curtailment basis in those cases where curtailment data is available. We thus exclude potential other revenue streams, such as the value from providing ancillary services, renewable energy credit value, savings from avoided transmission demand charges, or other externalities that are not included in wholesale prices, such as, for example, carbon mitigation value. Our market value that we present today can be thought of as representing either the revenue earned by merchant solar plants from selling power into organized markets, or the avoided cost of a load-serving entity that purchases power from a solar project instead of the wholesale market. We're thus quantifying the marginal value of the next increment of solar additions, which is different from the average value of all online solar projects. Next slide, please. The market value of solar varies by region and year and is largely driven by changes in average energy and capacity prices. I will first focus on the solar value in the 7 ISO markets shown here in the top graph. The energy value is depicted in blue, and as you can see, it's the dominant value component in most regions. From 2012 through 2019, the annual energy value of solar ranged from about $25 a megawatt hour to $70 a megawatt hour, and generally varied over time in concert with wholesale energy prices. For example, electricity prices fell since 2014, although 2018 brought a moderate value boost as electricity prices rose temporarily again. The main driver of that wholesale price decline since 2014 were decreasing natural gas prices, those secondary changes in generation mix, other fuel prices, and even solar deployment contributed to that price decline. The capacity value is shown in red in this graph, and to facilitate the comparison with solar's energy value, we denominate the capacity value in dollar per megawatt hour terms as well, by essentially spreading the capacity revenue over annual pre-curtailment generation. Solar's capacity value has a broad range, both between regions. In MISO, for example, it's only $1 megawatt hour. In SPP, on the other hand, it's $25 per megawatt hour in 2019. So it varies by region, but also within a region. In CAISO, it declined, for example, from $20 in 2013 to only $5 in 2019. Because ERCOT is an energy-only market with no formal capacity prices whatsoever, we don't show any capacity value for solar in Texas. In nearly all regions and years, solar's energy value is larger than its capacity value, often by twice as much. But capacity value can contribute a sizable portion of solar's total value, about 50% in SPP in most years, and 30 to 40% in PJM and ISO New England in 2019. Also interesting is that solar's capacity value is markedly higher than it is, for example, for wind power, where it generally ranges just from $1 to $5 a megawatt hour. Summing up energy and capacity values for solar, the total value then ranges from $40 to $80 per megawatt hour in most markets in the early years, 2012 to 2014, but then declined. In 2019, total market value ranged from the upper 20s in MISO and CAISO to $60 a megawatt hour in ERCOT. Similar to the ISO regions, solar's average annual and capacity value declined in most of the non-ISO utilities shown at the lower graph and ranged between nearly $30 in Arizona to $55 in Florida in 2019. And because solar's energy value is relatively similar across utilities, the value spread between utilities is primarily due to differences in solar's capacity value, which in turn is driven by variation in capacity credits and a large range in capacity prices. Of course, annual solar values vary by project. The colorful bars in this graph represent the generation weighted averages, while the small gray arrow bars represent the 10th and 90th percentile of solar annual values in each ISO or utility. Some markets show only very little variation in solar value in 2019. So ISO New England and PJM, for example, had value ranges of just 20%. But some others had fairly large discrepancies, and NISO and MISO values varied by up to 60%. Next slide, please. On this slide, we show variations in solar value for utility scale plants in our sample for the year 2019. So previously we had all sectors. This is now only focusing in on utility scale projects. The color of the bubbles indicates the combined energy and capacity value, while the size of the bubble indicates the capacity size of a given project. You can see again how values vary between regions. So low in CAISO and MISO and high in ERCOT, SPP and Florida, but also within regions. So for example, Western PJM has higher solar values than Eastern PJM. Some of that project level value variation is based on generation profiles, which are influenced, for example, by local climates or technical characteristics, such as use of single axis trackers. But they also vary because of locational energy and capacity prices. Transmission constraints and associated price volatility and curtailment play an especially big role in Western Texas in the Permian Basin. If you're interested in finding out more about the contribution of energy and capacity values for specific projects and how those have changed over the years, you can go to an interactive visualization on our project website. The link to that is at the bottom of the slides, and explore our estimates in much more detail. And you can actually also download a lot of the underlying data there for free. Next slide, please. So to provide a sense of whether solar provided above or below average value relative to other market participants, one can compare solar's annual value with the annual average wholesale energy and capacity prices across all generator and load nodes in a given ISO. That effectively represents the value of a generator that operates at full capacity in all hours of the year, or what we call a flat block of power. That's sometimes also known as around-the-clock value. So variations in the value of a flat block between ISOs and across years capture broader price differences and trends driven by changes in the fundamental drivers of average prices, and that helps to contextualize shifts in solar value over time or between regions. If we divide solar's value by the value of a flat block of power, the result is a pretty convenient metric that we call solar's value factor, and it indicates whether solar's value is above or below average market value, so whether it's above or below 100%. By expressing the value on a relative basis, the value factor normalizes changes in value that are due to a broader trends such as fuel and capacity prices or load growth dynamics, and it focuses on the degree to which solar's diurnal and seasonal generation profiles align with times of high wholesale power prices. This metric is therefore useful to explain solar valuation trends over time and to analyze the effects of increasing solar market penetration. This slide shows then the relationship between the solar value factor on the y-axis and solar's annual energy penetration level in each of the 7 ISOs from 2012 to 2019. And to make it a little easier to see trends in the high penetration markets, I've highlighted those with larger circles. For most ISOs, so that's ERCOT, SPP, MISO, PJM, and New York ISO, solar's market value clusters at high levels, mostly ranging from 125% to 175% of the value of a flat block of power. These high value factors indicate the robust value that solar can provide due to its alignment with higher than average energy prices during the day and its relatively significant contributions to capacity per unit of energy. And that basically just means that it has a high ratio of capacity credit to capacity factor. That said, solar penetrations in these 5 ISOs are still below 2%, so pretty modest. At higher penetration levels, solar generation can shift wholesale pricing patterns in ways that reduce ultimately solar's value. So solar's marginal operational costs are often near $0 a megawatt hour, and that can push wholesale prices during solar's peak generation hours to levels below where they would have been absent solar. And that's a phenomenon that is often called the merit order effect. In addition to solar's marginal capacity credit, which then declines at higher penetration as peak net loads shifts increasingly into the late afternoon and early evening hours. And so as a result of that, solar's total market value can decline at higher penetration levels. Solar's value factor in CAISO was 140% in 2012, when solar penetration was a little under 2%, but it declined to the average level of a flat block of power in 2015 as penetration grew to about 10%, and then fell even further to only 69% in 2019 at a penetration of nearly 19%. For most non-ISO utilities, shown again at the bottom here, solar's value factor in 2019 clustered between 125 and 150%. So that's pretty similar to many of the ISOs. But there were some notable exceptions with higher than typical value factors in Florida with nearly 160% and Colorado, a little more than 150. Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and Pacific Power East, on the other hand, had value factors under 100% once solar penetration exceeded 4% penetration. The value factor decline in the Southwest utilities seems to be accelerated and happened already at much lower penetration levels in comparison to CAISO. In CAISO, the value factor did not dip below 100% until after 10% penetration, driven by a strong decline in energy value relative to the average wholesale energy prices. This may be partly explained by differences between capacity credit calculation methods between these regions that either rely on peak load or peak net load contributions, and by reduced energy values as the energy imbalance market in the West has spread solar's merit order effect beyond the borders of CAISO in recent years already to neighboring regions. Next slide, please. To better understand the origin of value differences between solar generation and a flat block of power, we can differentiate the effects of location, curtailment, and profile. We again use the concept of a flat block value as our starting point. That is written in the black numbers at the bottom of the graph, and that shows how that flat block value varies by ISO. We start by depicting the relative difference between a flat block of power at all price nodes in an ISO and those that are located close to a solar project, and that's shown in gray. Overall, that has a pretty limited effect, with the exception of ERCOT. In a second step, we then compare value differences at those specific solar locations that are driven by solar's generation profile alone, and that is shown in gold. This is the dominant effect and can either be negative, as it's the case in CAISO, or highly positive, as it's the case in ERCOT and SPP. Finally, we adjust solar's value downward for reported curtailment. At the moment, we only have that data in CAISO and ERCOT, and that is shown in blue. In this report, we only focus on standalone solar projects, but we know that there's a lot of interest in solar and storage hybrids, especially out in the Southwest. And by shifting the solar generation into higher value hours, project developers can mitigate some of that profile-driven value decline in the higher penetration markets. So we're working on that, and stay tuned for more research by our group on that. Next slide, please. The energy value calculations presented so far are a product of actual solar generation and the real-time market prices, abbreviated here as RT. But alternatively, a plant could also participate in the day-ahead or DA market using day-ahead forecasts of generation and be paid day-ahead market prices. Any imbalances from the day-ahead forecast would then be settled at the real-time market. We estimate the potential additional value from day-ahead market participation by calculating a day-ahead premium. That's the difference in revenue for a solar plant that participates in the day-ahead market and then settles imbalances at real-time prices, and one that only delivers power in the real-time market. Historical solar forecasts for individual solar projects are derived from the North American Mesoscale Forecast System, that is abbreviated here as NAM, and are marked by an X in the graph. They are bounded on either side by either a perfect forecast, that's the circle on the left, and a very naive persistence forecast that uses the previous day's observed solar as the forecast for the current day. And that's the triangle on the right. I think there are two major takeaways here. The benefit of participating in the day-ahead market can vary a lot from year to year. So we find that the largest value boost of about $5 a megawatt hour occurred in the year 2018, while the next year, 2019, brought nearly no benefit at all if one assumes perfect foresight, or even a value penalty if forecast errors exceed 5%. The second takeaway is that the day-ahead premium declined somewhat with increasing forecast errors, but overall only moderately. And as a consequence, a very simple persistence forecast only underperforms a perfect forecast by just $1 to $2 a megawatt hour, at least on a fleet-wide basis. Next slide, please. To provide a general sense for how the wholesale value of solar and PPA or power purchase agreement prices compare over time, we plot PPA prices and market value in 4 ISOs and 2 broad non-ISO regions, the West and the Southeast. The green dots show the average levelized solar PPA price within each region among new contracts signed in each year. So while solar's market value within several of these regions has declined over time, falling PPA prices have largely kept pace, more or less maintaining solar's competitiveness. In some regions like PJM, the West or the Southeast, solar's 2019 energy and capacity value exceeded the levelized PPA price of contracts signed in 2019 by quite a bit. This suggests to me that an off-taker in these regions who purchased solar power through a PPA signed in 2019 paid less than they otherwise would have to pay when purchasing the same amount of power delivered at the same time and location as solar and capacity from a wholesale spot market. We don't have sufficient PPA records in our sample for 2019 in ERCOT, but assuming that PPA prices there are in the mid-20s, the value premium would have been especially large in Texas, driven by scarcity pricing during heat events in the summer of 2019. And I think this may be one of the reasons why the US utility scale solar market has been expanding away from California and especially into Texas and the Southeast. Thanks, Andrew.
So now we'll turn to examining the impacts of solar on the bulk power system. Because these impacts are evident in CAISO, but not yet in other ISO regions, most of the results from this section will focus on what we've seen in CAISO. We're going to examine the changes to the net load, shifts to pricing patterns, and assess evidence that the need for flexible resources is growing with increased deployment of solar. begin with, we see obvious impacts of solar on the shape of the net load, here shown at the top, creating the classic duck curve shape in the spring, but also impacting the shape of the net load in the other seasons too. The duck curve is characterized by the low minimum net load in the middle of the day, at the belly of the duck, and increasing net load ramps in the early evening at the neck of the duck. As evident in the middle chart, solar's impact to the net load shape impacts the timing of high and low prices too. The clearest impacts are the reduction in prices during the middle of the spring days and a shifting of high price periods in the summer to the early evening after sunset. In addition, we see evidence that growing procurement of regulation down ancillary service, along with the low energy prices in the middle of the day, is driving up this price for regulation down services, particularly in the spring. This increase in prices signals growing challenges with meeting this sub-hourly variability during solar production hours. Regulation reserves come from flexible technologies that can respond quickly to signals from the grid operator. Storage is increasingly providing regulating reserves, and the CAISO has also demonstrated the capability of wind or solar plants to provide these services, though that would come at the cost of added curtailment, and none of the plants currently provide that service. For all of these trends that we see in CAISO, we didn't see clear evidence of similar trends in the other ISOs, where the solar penetration is still below 5%. That belly of the duck curve, indicated by the low minimum net load periods, demonstrates that solar is reducing the minimum net load below the level that would be seen without solar. Without solar, the minimum net load would occur at night. With solar, the minimum net load is only about 50% of what it would have otherwise been. This lower minimum net load indicates a growing need for flexibility, as other resources need to be able to back down to lower levels in the middle of the day. One indicator that backing down is getting more difficult is to look for negative prices. Negative prices suggest that resources are unwilling to back down even if they're paid for it, or are willing to produce even if they have to pay to provide power. Negative prices occurred prior to the significant deployment of solar, but the results from CAISO show that nearly all negative prices in 2019 now occur during solar production hours. In contrast, negative prices at major trading hubs in other ISOs are much less likely to occur during solar production hours. The neck of the duck, indicated by the steeper net load ramps, demonstrates that solar is increasing the net load ramp rates above the level that would have been seen without solar. 1 hour net load ramp rates are about 50% higher, and 3 hour net load ramp rates are about 30% higher than they would have been without solar in the California ISO. These higher net load ramp rates indicate a growing need for flexibility, as other resources now need to be able to ramp up production as solar production ramps down. And one indicator that ramping is getting more difficult is to look for price spikes in hours when solar is increasing the ramp rate. And we're looking particularly for these to be increasing the ramp rate above what it would have been otherwise without solar. Price spikes indicate that wholesale markets are somewhat struggling to maintain a balance between supply and demand and are willing to pay more for resources that can increase output. In general, these price spikes are not uncommon across all of the ISOs, but CAISO shows a small but steady increase in the frequency of price spikes occurring during these solar ramping hours. The full report has additional details on a number of other ramping metrics that we looked at that tell a somewhat more nuanced story than we can tell from just looking at these price spikes. But the full report also describes results from a regression analysis that looks at what resources are responding the most on days with higher ramps. And one of the important findings was that imports, aided in part by the Western energy imbalance market, are one of the key resources that help in meeting these ramping needs. As such, some of these broader shifts in the system have helped to mitigate the impact of growing solar deployment in California ISO. In addition to lower minimum net load levels and higher ramp rates, solar also introduces greater uncertainty in the day-ahead market. The day-ahead net load forecast errors are 50% higher with solar than they would have otherwise been. These higher net load forecast errors can require real-time dispatch of resources to be different than what was planned based on the day-ahead forecast. Again, this is increasing the need for flexibility. Under some conditions, forecast errors can even lead to commitment of quick start units that wouldn't have been economic had the forecast been more accurate. Even so, we didn't find a clear signal that significant day-ahead forecast errors are necessarily accompanied by extreme differences in the day-ahead and real-time prices. The gray boxes down here in the figures on the bottom, they show the range of the net load forecast errors without solar. Forecast errors that are within the gray boxes are within the range of forecast errors that would have been expected even without solar, whereas forecast errors outside of these gray boxes are now larger because of solar. And while there are some examples of large underforecasts of net load being accompanied by a large price difference, the examples outside of these gray boxes don't appear to be any more severe than the examples inside of the gray boxes. So overall, we've seen several ways that solar has increased the need for flexibility and impacted prices in California ISO. So here we look to see if those changes have made it more attractive to invest in flexible resources. The chart shows the trend in the energy and ancillary service revenues, net of any operating costs, for 3 different flexible resources: a combustion turbine, that's the CT, a reciprocating internal combustion engine or RICE engine, and a 4-hour battery. As the solar penetration has grown in CAISO since 2012, we see that the incentives to invest in flexible generation has also increased, particularly for the RICE engine and the 4-hour battery. We saw that the combustion turbine revenue was increasing up through 2018, but then in 2019, the net revenue decreased in part due to some changes in the price of natural gas relative to wholesale market prices in that year. But overall, we see that these trends suggest a synergy in which a growing need for flexibility impacts wholesale market prices, which in turn can increase the incentives for more flexible resources to participate in the market. This synergy, though, depends on wholesale market prices fully reflecting the actions taken by the system to maintain reliability, which, as we'll discuss somewhat at the end, is not always the case and is an area of ongoing reform. One other note about the non-ISO regions is that some cases the solar penetration is high enough to show some similar impacts to what we saw in the California ISO. We've seen minimum net load levels decrease due to solar in public service of New Mexico, which already had fairly low minimum net load levels because of wind. We've also seen that reduction in Arizona Public Service and in Nevada Power. We've similarly seen an increase in 1-hour net load ramp rates for utilities in the Southwest, along with some of the utilities in North Carolina. So one other impact we wanted to look at was to see if we could get a sense of how solar performs on days when the system is most stressed. As an indicator of system stress, we use NERC's System Risk Index, which is a daily indicator of the difficulty of generating and delivering power to US loads. The higher the indicator in this SRI column, the more stressed the system was on that day. We have severe events are listed on the top, while severe events in the non-summer months are on the bottom. One thing that jumps out is that days with the highest risk were often associated with severe weather of some form. And you can see that in the event types and the titles here on the far left. For each of the highest risk days between 2012 and 2019, we then measured the daily solar generation relative to the average production in the same month. The larger the blue bar, the more solar was producing relative to its average level for the same month. For summer events, this daily solar production was at least 50% of what you would see on average in the same month, suggesting that solar tends to mitigate these stressful periods, at least to some degree. On the other hand, results for non-summer months were more mixed. Some severe winter storms or hurricanes reduced solar output well below average levels for the same months. Others, like the polar vortex in 2014, still had decent solar production relative to the average levels expected for those months. Just reflecting on the recent crisis in ERCOT, we do plan to create a comparable metric based on solar performance in future iterations of this analysis. But for now, just a preliminary look at the fleet-wide solar production shows that during this recent event in ERCOT, solar was offline when the load shedding first began, because that happened in the middle of the night. But then during the ensuing days, solar production was well above the level that was counted on in the resource adequacy assessment. That was that 7% I mentioned earlier. So metrics like these, based on performance during these stressful events, may help to inform ongoing discussions about resource adequacy and preparation for these extreme weather events. Finally, in addition to the impacts to the wholesale power markets, there are a number of other important issues that have been raised with solar integration into the grid. First, NERC noted unexpected performance of solar inverters during some various grid disturbances, and they noted that these could lead to reliability issues if they were not addressed. In particular, they saw faults on large transmission lines that could lead to simultaneous tripping of hundreds of megawatts of solar. What they saw was that inverter settings needed to be adjusted to prevent this sort of behavior. Second, the CAISO has seen increasing challenges with maintaining adequate frequency response as the share of inverter-based resources is increasing. Currently, the CAISO contracts with resources outside of California to help meet its frequency response obligation. These contracts are not necessarily reflected in wholesale power prices, and that is something that the CAISO is looking to reform currently. And then finally, NERC has made several recommendations to improve the visibility and representation of distributed PV in operations and in planning. So in summary, we found that the effects of solar growth on net load, wholesale prices, and solar's market value can readily be seen in California. The effects of solar are small in other organized wholesale markets where the solar penetrations are below 5%. And we see that California has low net load during spring days and high ramps as the sun sets in the evening. And similar patterns emerge in real-time prices, with lower prices during the day and higher prices in the early evening. We also see that negative prices during solar hours, price spikes in solar ramping hours, and higher prices for regulation down reserves all suggest some growing challenges with providing flexibility. However, some broader shifts in the system, including this growing participation of Western utilities in the Western energy imbalance market, and also variations in hydropower levels, appear to have mitigated some of the challenges in 2019. We've seen that the decline in solar's wholesale market value in California has been matched by reductions in the cost of solar, thus maintaining solar's overall net value proposition. And in markets outside of California, the costs have so far declined faster than market value, often making solar more competitive than ever before. We also saw that impacts on wholesale power prices can increase the attractiveness of storage and other flexible resources to meet these early evening net load peaks and ancillary service requirements. So you can go to the webpage listed here and download the full report. You can also find this briefing deck and some of the underlying data. And just wanted to close by thanking DOE again for sponsoring this work, along with comments that we got on earlier versions of this report from several industry experts. So we have about 15 minutes left for questions, and we'd be happy if you please use that Q&A function to submit your questions, and we'll start going through those now.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Maybe we can start by one question that was asked about the day-ahead market participation. I had presented there only one metric across all the ISOs, and attendee asked whether there are large differences between the different ISOs.
Yes, so this metric is just showing the aggregate across all of the solar that was deployed in these different years. And so this result is going to be heavily weighted towards California because that's where a lot of the solar plants are seen. So this sort of reflects mostly what we see in California. We do see variation across ISOs in terms of these metrics. And it's not in this report. Unfortunately, the report just has this result that we're showing here, but we'll have a full paper that's coming out fairly shortly that will go into look at this at each of the different ISOs. And I'd say that, in terms of the variation, we see that, that there are a lot of factors that can drive differences on average between day-ahead and real-time prices. And that's what sort of causes these different lines to move up and down, more so than what we see the forecast errors causing. And those factors can really vary from region to region. So we do see a lot of variation, and it's kind of difficult sometimes to understand why you see persistent differences between day-ahead and real-time prices in different market regions. But that's an important consideration.
Yeah. Maybe staying on the market value aspect real quick. So David asks, whether the regional variations in the solar capacity factor interact with declining solar value as penetration increases. So, and I think to some extent you're onto something there. The penetration number, of course, takes into account already the output of solar. So if you are in a higher capacity factor market, you just need less solar capacity in order to reach a similar amount of solar energy and energy penetration then. The capacity factor also plays a role in how we spread the capacity revenue that is usually awarded on a per kilowatt or megawatt year basis over generation, and so that is another interaction that we touched upon. There was one other question about whether or not there is any correlation between energy and capacity prices in solar, or I guess value. And I would say there are two different effects. On the one hand, with increasing solar penetration, you do have this merit order effect where solar, when it is operating at large numbers, it just pushes the generator stack outward a little bit, if you kind of think of the classical demand and supply curves. And so because of that, then the energy prices decrease once, when solar is operating at large numbers. And so the energy value decreases. Similarly, then the capacity credit can decrease at higher penetrations, but the capacity value is the product of two factors: the capacity credit on the one hand, and then capacity prices on the other hand. So there's some degree of correlation there, but there are other factors that play a role.
And I see a question here of, did we study the price ramp correlation for other ISOs? And was it similar to the CAISO, or were the effects negligible? I think the main thing to see is that we didn't find that solar was increasing the net load ramp rates beyond what we had seen without solar. And so there was less of sort of, there might be some ramping that's happening during solar hours, but it's not necessarily outside of the range of what would be expected other times. And so we didn't see that there was much of a correlation in these other regions between prices, these price spikes happening, and solar ramping hours. And instead, we don't see that there's increased ramping because of solar. And so we're not kind of expecting the price spikes to be occurring during those times yet.
One person asked whether or not, if we could just kind of discuss the behind the meter solar versus utility scale solar and how that affects our analysis. So for the most part, we focus here on the aggregate effect of solar, given that the solar generation profiles of behind the meter and in front of the meter utility scale installations, are somewhat correlated. Of course, utility scale installations have trackers and often have a higher DC to AC inverter loading ratio, and that kind of can increase the shoulders of the generation profile a little bit. But overall, they tend to produce at similar times. So that's why we have decided to model distributed solar and utility scale solar, and then for the most part focus here on the aggregate solar value. But there are some differences. Part of the differences are driven just by available local prices. So we often find, it depends a little bit on the transmission system, but at load pockets, the LMP's nodal prices are often a little higher. And so because of that, the wholesale energy value of those behind the meter installations that are often co-located at these load pockets tends to be a little higher. But then a lot of that is consumed on site and doesn't really make it to the grid. And we're not really getting into distribution system losses or anything like that. So for the most part, we are really just focused here on the aggregate value.
Great. There's a couple of comments about looking at how you can see sort of declining costs to serve daytime electric vehicle charging at workplaces, maybe also impacts of solar changing the value of wind power that tends to peak more at night. And I think that's kind of well illustrated by these figures, that if you did have a customer who had some sort of pricing that exposed them to more real-time prices, that they might be able to charge their vehicle during the middle of the day. Maybe that would be more likely at, say, a commercial installation where they could be doing workplace charging or something like that. And so these shifts in the pricing patterns would sort of change when you'd want to be charging your electric vehicle, and then maybe where you'd want to be doing that. And then similarly, shifting higher prices later and later into the evening, that might decrease the market value of additional solar, but that might push those times to be more aligned with times where wind is generating. We don't go into that in particular in this report, but you can kind of see those shifts in the prices. And in fact, we have seen some other analysis that indicates that at the same time that the market value of solar is decreasing in California ISO, the market value of additional onshore wind is slightly increasing in the California ISO, and it's just because of those factors.
There was one more question about the value of solar trends between utility scale and residential projects. And so while for the most part in the report, we do only look at aggregate values, I wanted to point those that are analytically minded among you and like to play with data yourself to our project website, the emp.lbl.gov/renewable-grid-insights. And there at the bottom of the description of the report content, you can actually find a link to an external data repository where we have posted both hourly modeled solar generation records for each solar project and county, and then also annual average values for each county and each solar project that we modeled. And so if you're really interested in teasing out, individual differences, all the underlying data that we use for our report is there and is available and open to the public. So you can dive into that if you want to yourself.
Okay, then I'll take a couple of questions here, more on the market impact side. So one of them was, is solar allowed to provide regulation down service? And from what I understand, there's been some demonstrations of that capability, but that there's no resources that are currently qualified to do that in CAISO. And even it's not clear that participation models for resources to do that are well lined out so that they could do that. But there's definitely been a demonstration of that capability, and sort of moving from demonstration to actually having participants providing that service is sort of the next step. I will note that in one of the California ISO Market Monitor reports for 2019, they noted that there was some solar that had qualified to provide spinning reserves for the first time, but the amount of provision was not shown in any of the charts. So that sort of provision of ancillary services from solar plants is starting to increase. And I think also the other thing to note is that there's a real growing trend towards co-locating batteries with solar in California, and batteries are demonstrating a significant provision of various ancillary services alongside with those. So then the other question was on the price spikes, just in terms of how we define these. So when we're looking at negative prices and the frequency of negative prices, that really is just looking at the frequency of times where the average hourly price had dropped below zero. Whereas when we talk about price spikes, the way that we've defined that is that we take a price spike to be where the real-time energy price has risen to 3 times the level of what the operating cost would be of a combustion turbine that has a sort of static heat rate that we assume but we use daily natural gas prices to get that. So it's sort of, you'd look at the fuel cost of that combustion turbine on that particular day and its heat rate, and then you compare that to what the electricity price is. And if that electricity price is 3 times that operating cost, we call that a price spike, and list that here. So that's what's showing in the light blue bars is the frequency of those events. And then just in the dark blue bars, that's those events occurring at times when there was a need for increased ramp beyond what had been seen without solar.
There was one question about whether or not there are any notable trends coming from the Pacific Northwest. So we've not looked at the Pacific Northwest in this study, just because we needed to limit our data analysis a little bit. But of course, Oregon and Washington State do have high clean energy standard goals. And they do see an increase in build out of solar generators. Oregon in particular has a lot of purpose-driven generation assets there. We've not looked at them in this analysis, so unfortunately we cannot speak about particular value trends from that region. Similarly, there was a question about whether or not value trends from Hawaii might be interesting and useful to compare with other high solar penetration regions, and I agree that that would be really interesting. HECO, the main utility in Hawaii, doesn't really have like an organized market where we can very easily observe hourly prices and then price effects of solar and how that kind of has developed over time. So that's just one of the data limitations that we have when looking at the organized markets in the United States and the limited coverage.
Great. And then maybe the final question here, and we have a number of outstanding ones that we'll still try to follow up afterwards. But one other one that was raised was just to discuss the impact of solar generation during last summer's CAISO crisis. So during August 14th and 15th last summer, there was significant load shedding that occurred in some regions. And we again, we'll kind of include that in the next iteration of this, where this was just data through 2019. But you can see during those events that there was solar reduction was occurring during those times, in part because it was the end of the day, and so solar was ramping down during this heat wave. And then at the same time, there was also some significant cloud cover because of some storms that had reduced the output at some of those. So the primary events happened really kind of at the end of the time when solar was ramping down, and the net load was still quite high at that time. So instead of having a peak load that was happening in the middle of the day, the net peak load had shifted into the early evening hours, closer to 6 o'clock or so, and that's when that event occurred. And so you'd see quite low solar production by that time when the load shedding was occurring. But again, that'll be something that we'll focus more on in the next iteration of this report. So with that, we're at the top of the hour here. Just wanted to thank everybody for participating and for the great questions. We will try to follow up on these remaining ones. And wanted to remind you that this webinar was recorded, and we'll send out a notice when the recording is posted and available, in case you have any colleagues who would like to watch it or follow up at a later time. We thank you again, and we hope you have a good day. Thanks.